Under the Pakistan Penal Code, it's sections 96 to 106 that deal with the right to private defense. The most important thing in that is that there are certain exceptions to private defense, right? And so Section 99 provides those cases in which there's no right of private defense. And for example, one of the most important things in these provisions is that the principle of proportionality has been embedded therein, which means that you cannot use more force than is necessary to protect your life and your property. So in the DHA case, what we see is a police officer being shot at point blank range in the head. Now, that is not covered under the right of private defense, though I believe there was a video that was issued by the assailant in which he seems to be taking this right of private defense. But if you read sections 96 to 106 of the PPC, you can clearly see that it does not apply in this case, and the manner in which he was exercising so-called right of private defense was excessive. So I don't think that this defense would be applicable in this instant case. So I think this is something that there is a lot of jurisprudence on as well. And if you see, and you can't look at this in a vacuum, you have to examine it in the context of abuse of police powers in general. So we have to see, for example, that there's numerous judgments of the high courts and of the Supreme Court which talk about how under Section 54 of the Criminal Procedure Code, how the police are given wide powers to arrest on the basis of mere suspicion. Obviously, in India, the Criminal Procedure Code has been amended now to incorporate certain safeguards. Our Criminal Procedure Code doesn't contain that. So in this instant case, or in general, when you're talking about the right to private defense and you're talking about good faith and bad faith, that's also examined by looking at the circumstances. You're also seeing, for example, when the police are making an arrest, on what basis do they have a reasonable suspicion? Is it information given to them in writing by a senior police officer? Is it information they've received from an informant? So there are complications within this, and the major problem comes even when you do go to the courts. And this has been discussed, like I said, by many high courts and by the Supreme Court as well, that in such cases, the police cannot just act on the basis of vague information. But the problem is that our legislation is such, because it's colonial era legislation, that we haven't exactly been able to establish a standard on this. I think that obviously there need to be more stringent gun laws, but we again can't look at that in a vacuum, because in Pakistan, we do have massive abuse of power by police, by intelligence agencies, by various law enforcement. So in a way, this right to protect yourself, and if we compare it with the US, where they have an amendment, constitutional amendment, which deals with that, we don't actually have such a provision in Pakistan, but we do need some sort of stringent legislative framework, because as you said, there are no tests, there are no preliminary assessments. So that means that anybody with contacts, which is what the case usually is in Pakistan, contacts in the Interior Ministry, contacts in government, is able to secure licenses for their weapons. And that is a major problem. But again, like looking at that on one side and the need for that legislative framework to come in, but then also curtailing abuse of powers by the police and by other law enforcement agencies, because the reason why many people have tried to acquire arms, and to the best of my knowledge, especially in the last decade or so, is because they do not trust law enforcement personnel. There is a lack of trust in the abilities and in the intent of law enforcement. And this again goes back to the fact that we still have colonial era laws. We haven't changed to community policing, which is what the world over the pattern is, that you switch to community policing, and the police is meant to protect the community rather than trying to extract money or extract confessions through use of torture, etc., all things that are illegal. So there are two issues here, and it's important to look into both of them. I think just one of the most important things is that Section 54 of the Criminal Procedure Code that needs to be amended, or at the very least, there need to be more stringent safeguards or some sort of structuring of discretion of law enforcement agencies. Because what often happens is that police make arrests under Section 54 of the Criminal Procedure Code. Someone files a habeas corpus petition before the High Court, the person is produced, so the case ends there and then. There's actually a really interesting judgment, I believe, of the Lahore High Court on this, which talks about how even the role of the courts then is limited because they can't proceed once the person has been recovered. And so they often leave this to the government, the respective provincial or federal government, to deal with or to structure police discretion or police powers under Section 54 of the CRPC. Now, in India, they have Section 50 of the Criminal Procedure Code, which lays down safeguards for arrest and for detention. But just we have a generic sort of provision in our constitution for that. But at the time of arrest or at the time when the police stop you, we don't actually have any protections like they do in the Indian Criminal Procedure Code. So there is a need for legislative reform urgently. Why we're failing to do that is perhaps because our police force still functions as a colonial force.